Suheldev, the king who saved India. And Amish, welcome, and thank you for making the time to have a chat with us about this event. Shall we start with something which is most interesting for me, given that I have had a background in publishing, which is that you mentioned that the book is written as part of a writers' collective. And I found it absolutely fascinating that a novel, a work of historical fiction, and this is your eighth, which has such a strong imprint of you as an individual and as an author. I was curious if you would say a bit, as briefly as you can, about how actually a group of people sat down to write a book. And when I say how actually, what I mean is that, like, I was curious, I know you described it a bit in the beginning, but I'm curious, like, how many people were there in the collective? How did it work? Yeah. And so on and so forth. Because ultimately, the responsibility of the content of the book lies with you.
Right, yeah. One of the key problems that I have is that I have too many story ideas for one lifetime. And I mean it genuinely, I'm not saying it facetiously. My biggest problem is not that I will run out of ideas to write. My biggest problem is I'll run out of life before I finish all my ideas, and I cannot carry my my story ideas to my cremation pyre. That will be a wasted life, and my soul will keep haunting the world, I guess. So this was an idea from my team in Mumbai. That how about if we start a writer center? Now this has been done in the West. So writers like Wilbur Smith, James Patterson, they have done it. In India, it has never been tried. And the concept is very simple. You essentially hire published writers. So I have hired 4 published writers who I pay fixed amounts to. So they carry no risk of the book. And if I start on a project and I don't like it and I dump the book, they still get their money. And how it works is I make the initial story summary, so which could be a 5,000 word, 10,000 word story summary, which I then give to the writer center. Could be one writer, could be 3 or 4 together. I tell them what research needs to be done, and they would make the first manuscript, the first draft of the manuscript, which would be say 65,000, 70,000 words. Then it comes to me. And I work on the second draft and finalize the manuscript. What this in effect does is expands my capacity so that I can finish all the story ideas that I have before I die. Now there are 2 things that I try and keep because I'm a control freak, right? I irritate the hell out of everyone who works with me, at least on my book side. Hopefully I'm a little nicer on the Nehru Centre side. But unlike say James Patterson, who from what I know delegates quite a lot of the story to his writer's center, I'm a control freak. I will say what the story is, and then they write. I'm of course open to feedback, but I am not gonna take some if someone else suggests a story which will come into the writer's center, that's not going to happen. It's going to be my story, right? The second thing is that there are core books of mine which only I will write, which are core tentpoles in the universe that I want to build. So like the Shiva trilogy, Ramchandra series, Mahabharata, those only I will write. Then there are other books which, while important to me, are not as core, which could be the Indian Chronicles, etc. So those I will work with the Writer Center. That's essentially the concept. And from what I've been told, my readers, my biggest fear was readers shouldn't read this book and feel that it doesn't feel like an Amish book. Right?
Yeah.
It should read just like any of my other books. If it doesn't, then I'd much rather not release the book. The second thing, at no point do I want to mislead the readers, by putting only my name on it. They should know that it is a part of a collective effort. It's not just mine. So therefore, that's why we put, Writer Center clearly on it. If it's only one writer, then we'll put that one writer's name.
Sorry, had you finished?
Yeah.
Okay.
Done. I'm drinking water.
Yeah.
This is water. There's nothing else.
That's all. Okay, that's interesting, because I've read a couple of your earlier books, and this book, which I'm delighted to show here,
I have a copy too. Bye.
This book I actually read twice. I read it first when I bought it, and then I read it again over the last 2-3 days, because I knew I was going to have this conversation with you, and one couldn't necessarily have told a difference of style, but then I have not followed it that carefully. Which brings me to my next question, which, as an academic, and as you know, that this is a period that I have done research on, and it's a period that I am extremely interested in from an academic perspective. One of the things that I was very struck by, and is related to the first answer that you've just given, is that you mention that, just as you mentioned that you don't have enough time to write all stories, you also talk about the inspiration for this story and for a lot of your other stories, that you were actually inspired to write this. What exactly does divine inspiration to tell a story entail when it comes to writing historical fiction, which is how this book is marketed?
No, damn good question. And I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to be rude. I was looking at the phone to retweet your tweet on the Facebook thing. Look, essentially, you know how it is for an artist, right? It's a different gig as compared to being a banker or say a director of a cultural center, you know, where there is space for the rational left brain as well in how you make your decisions. But when you're deciding what story to write on, at least the way it works for me, it must be completely instinct driven. It must be from the heart. So there has to be a story which just kind of grabs your soul. And at some level, it should be that it grabs your soul at such a deep level that you genuinely don't care if the story succeeds or not. Because then you're not writing it for others, you're writing it for yourself, because you want to say the story, right? That's how all the story ideas that I pick, you know, picking would be the wrong term. I mean, it comes to me, but which stays with me. There are many story ideas which come to me, which don't inspire me, and they just move on. This is one of those stories which truly grabbed my soul. I discovered this story at a conference in Goa, actually. Two scholar friends of mine, Abhinav Prakash, who's a professor in Delhi University, and Sanjeev Sanyal, who's a principal economic advisor to the government of India and a scholar. Both of them are scholars. They told me of the story of King Suheldev. Now, King Suheldev is from Shravasti, which is a little ahead of Ayodhya, from Uttar Pradesh, the state that my father's family is from. Right? And I hadn't heard of him. Right? And that made me ashamed at some level. And also angry that how come we don't know the story of such a consequential hero, right? In any other country, if there was a hero like this, there would have been statues of his, you know, in every city. He would be there in every history book, because you think about what he achieved, right? For India. This was a time from the 11th to the 16th, 17th century. You're a history buff, you know. That was the time when the global military superpower were the Turks. And the Turks aren't originally from Turkey. That's a common misconception. They are actually originally from Central Asia. Right? And that was a time when almost no nation could stand up to their armies. Right? They, of course, conquered and destroyed much of India. But they also conquered and destroyed much of the Arab world, large parts of Europe. They were the foot soldiers of the Mongol armies, which conquered China. I mean, they were the military superpowers for 500, 600 years, and the world has not seen conquerors like them. Right? Their entire, the entire tribe, the entire race was built for just one function and one function alone: the fine art of warfare. Nothing else. Right? Timur was a Turk. He killed 5% of the world's population 800 years ago. Right? At a time when they were, think about it, no nuclear bombs, no dynamites, no machine. It wasn't easy to kill 5% of the world's population. Right? These were the hordes attacking India. Right? And at 1034, this king Suheldev, from a subaltern caste, he's a subaltern caste Hindu. He's not from an upper caste, and the prince of a small principality in North India forges an army together of Hindus of all castes, of Indian Muslims, of Buddhists, and gives such a devastating defeat to the Turks that no Turkic tribe returns to India for 150 years. I mean, it's such a fascinating and inspiring story, right? I mean, it is Braveheart times 1 million, right? But,
Okay.
and he's been airbrushed out of our history books. That's damn unfortunate.
Okay. Let me just say a few things here. I'm listening to you with a lot of attention. The first thing is that I would at some point contest a statement like Turks were made to be a conquering people. The contribution of the Turks to a lot of world history is very profound in many ways and very positive in many ways. That's one. The second thing is that did the Turks destroy and what entails military warfare, which was a very common practice of politics in all pre-modern and sadly even modern societies. But your point is made that you wanted to write this story, and you have, and I will come back to the facticity. Because that is, this being an academic discussion, I will come back to the facticity of historical fiction across the world. It's not just about India, as you said. Even this is something that, and I read a lot of historical fiction because I am interested in history. And I have a PhD in Islamic history, so I'm very interested in it. But before we come on to that, what is the function of this genre of history writing, of fiction writing, is that given that this is your 8th novel, of which 6 earlier ones have been historical fiction, and 1 is actually non-fiction. Immortal India is non-fiction. And given that it has extensive sales, who in your own view do you think is your target audience? Who do you think reads your books?
Most of my books are primarily read by the youth, but I gotta tell you honestly, I don't really think of a target audience when I'm writing.
No, sorry to interrupt. I wasn't asking you whether you as an author think of a target audience when you write and therefore market it accordingly. What I meant was, in retrospect, having written a fair number of books, what is your perception? That's why I said, what is your perception of who your target audience is? What is the market feedback, if that is that clarifies?
It's largely the youth. My books, I think all 8 books put together, I've sold some 5.5 million copies till now. That's a figure that I've been told by my publishers. And almost 96-97% of those sales would be in India. And a vast majority of it, judging by people who come to my events, people who are at Facebook, Twitter, people who follow me, are largely the youth. So most of my readers are largely the youth, and the book sells in good numbers in Indian languages as well. So in Hindi, in Tamil, in Malayalam, in Kannada, in Telugu, Marathi, Gujarati, Bengali, Assamese. So it's been translated into all these languages. They're all selling well, God's grace. Yeah, and people across, I guess, the social spectrum, people across religious groups, but largely the youth. Largely the youth.
Yeah,
That's where
yeah,
where my this thing is.
Yeah, my question was directed more towards what your perception of it is, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And thank you. Now I'm interested before I come on to the historical aspect of fiction, because the book describes itself as a work of historical fiction. But before that, since you have written as much as you have, I was curious to begin with asking you a bit about just writing fiction. Yeah. Now, for a very long time now, it has been a fairly established understanding that once a book is written and published and put out into the world, there is a sense in which the author loses control over it. Right? There is what Roland Barthes called the death of the author, which is the author no longer actually can do anything else to change it. It's out in the open now. There is also something called the reader's construction of narrative, which is that 10 different...
They say something, but he gets something else. He or she gets something else.
Yeah, or deciphers the story in a different way, etc. Okay. So, and this applies to all genres of writing, all kinds of writing, not just historical fiction writing. It also applies to, academic writing. Applies very much to academic writing, and so on and so forth. My interest, given the fact that this is historical fiction, is that having been as successful as you have been, have you ever thought that what you have said has either been misunderstood or has got miscommunicated, or readers have taken from it what you didn't really quite want them to go away with? And the reason I say that is that what often happens in all kinds of writing and publication, and I say this both as an author as well as a publisher, that readers can often take away only a slice of what you have written and not take away the entirety. But that slice may not always be truly representative of what the larger message was.
It's not just a lot of authors, it's a lot of every single one of us. Right? All of us will get misunderstood. Sometimes, sadly, in the modern day, deliberately. You find so often, you can make out, especially in this age of social media, people deliberately misinterpret, what someone else may have said, and start outrage. That is sadly, that's the way life is. What an author has to do is try and make sure that his language, the way he communicates is as clear as possible. Right? So, for example, if you judge from the Indian writing traditions, the Indic writing traditions, I mean, the gods for us Indian writers are essentially Valmiki ji and Ved Vyas ji. They're the models. Everyone else, when Kalidas, for example, follows Valmiki ji's model. Right? And in a way, Ved Vyas ji and Valmiki ji were both poets, because what they wrote was the Mahabharata and the Valmiki Ramayana have been written in the style of Sanskrit poetry. But if you see the style of communication, Valmiki ji spends a lot more time on descriptions, on beautiful turns of phrase, of and again, that was Valmiki ji's style. Nothing is better or worse. Right? And Kalidas, you can clearly see follows that style. So much so that, in Meghadutam, the way Kalidas described the cloud was very similar. And there are, many of the aficionados have noticed that it was very similar to how Valmiki ji described the clouds when Lord Ram was waiting, to cross over into Lanka, right, to save Goddess Sita. That is one style where it is, the phrase, you can get lost in the beauty of the language. That's Valmiki ji's style. Ved Vyas ji, if you notice, was very crisp, very direct. No, you wouldn't waste too much time, right? Just get on with the philosophies that you want to convey, the action that you want to convey. I'm not saying any style is better or worse, but most Indic rooted writers tend to go into one of these two groups, and I tend to follow Ved Vyas ji's approach. That make it clear, make it crisp, focus more on the philosophies and getting the incidents moving. Because often when you take people on very roundabout ways, the meaning can get lost, right? Nothing wrong with that. People enjoy a walk in the park rather than just running straight. Possible too, walking and meandering. There's a beauty to that too. But if you're concerned more about communicating messages or philosophies, then you want the language to be clear, direct, so that there's less scope for miscommunication. But can anyone make any author ensure that all miscommunication, misunderstandings go down to zero? No, it's not possible.
No, that wasn't what I was
asking. You have to kind of live with it.
What I was asking, yes, of course. What I was asking was, have you ever felt that you have been misunderstood, or you felt that X was miscommunicated? That's what I was asking. I wasn't saying you can guarantee.
Point out one man to me, one man or woman to me, who says they have never been misunderstood, and I will point out a liar. Okay, all of us have been misunderstood. Authors even more so. Anyone in the public space, even more so. It's the very nature of communication. We will say one thing, someone else will get something else. It's the very nature of communication. How do you control it? You can try your best to be as clear as possible, as precise as possible, as concise as possible. But that's the best that you can do.
As we all do. Fair enough. So let me ask you the obverse of the same question. Again, from an academic perspective, which is, if what you have just said is correct, and I agree with you, that despite any author's best intentions, the possibility of being misunderstood remains. My question is, do you think that when it comes to writing historical fiction, instead of, say, just fiction, there is a different responsibility to writing historical fiction, because what fiction allows you to do, and I'm going to give you a few examples from this very book, what fiction allows you to do is that fiction gives you a certain kind of literary license. Okay, that is why it is quite literally fiction. Okay, and you can bring in a lot of interesting and even amusing things because you are functioning within the framework of fiction. Okay, so to give you a couple of examples from this book, there are dialogues that begin with shit. Okay, there is a suggestively romantic scenario in which one of the reactions of one of the characters is touche. Okay, this is completely literary license. Okay, and it speaks to a certain audience. Okay, and I was struck by it because the shit example actually comes more than once, as I'm sure you remember, and that's absolutely fine. But
you remember.
this is fine. This is fine when it functions within the realm of fiction. Okay, and you make it very clear that this is fiction. But you also say at the beginning, on the back cover, that however fictionalized this account may be, it's the core is our true events. The rest has been fictionalized. Yes, fine. That's okay. Now, should that be so? And we will come to the whole question of historicity and etc. Should that be so? You do you think that there is a different responsibility that comes with writing historical fiction, because people who do not spend years like I have done, and so many other of my fellow colleagues have done, studying history as a discipline and as a subject, they may actually run the risk of thinking that some of the bits that you are writing as part of fiction may either be true or may be indicative of truth. Do you think there is a different responsibility? Or could you just write anything in the name of fiction?
Look, the key thing is what drives you. So for example, did people have bodily functions at that time? Did they eat and shit? Yes, even 1,000 years ago they did. But okay, that was a facetious comment. But if I speak of it seriously, I think the difference is that what are you going to hold as an author? What are you going to hold primary as the primary locus around which the story will be built? There are some guys, there are some authors for whom showcasing that research and using that correct language is the primary locus around which they build it. There are some authors, who would feel that the primary locus for me is some messages that I want to convey. And for that, if I have to make the book easy to understand and use modern terms so that it doesn't feel like a difficult read for the readers, as Gore Vidal did, for example, in Julian, he doesn't use the term Mediolanum. He doesn't use the term Mediolanum. He says Milan, because again, I can get that in a book, your primary job as an author is not to show off that, look at my brilliant research. That's my approach. I'm not saying it has to be everyone's approach. It's not to show off that, look how well read I am, or look at my brilliant research. Your job is to try and convey the story in as easy to understand a manner as you can. Gore Vidal did that in Julian, and Londinium instead of London instead of Londinium, etc. That's one way. The other way, if you want to quote an Indian example, for example, the version of the Ramayana that most Indians are aware of today is actually based on Goswami Tulsidas ji's Ramcharitmanas, not the original Valmiki Ramayana. Why? I think one of the key reasons for that is Goswami Tulsidas ji wrote it in Awadhi and used coarse, simple words and the idiom of the 16th century, right? Which made it easy to understand for the Indians of the 16th century. Right?
And could I interrupt and tell you very briefly that, as I'm sure you're aware, not only starting from the Bhils, but from many others, that there are many understood and practiced and narrative traditions and versions of the Ramayana.
Oh yeah, I mean, for example, the Lakshman Rekha is not there in the original Valmiki Ramayana. It's not mentioned in the original Valmiki Ramayana. And the first, at least from all the versions that I've read, the first time it is mentioned is in the Goswami Tulsidas ji's Ramcharitmanas. And even there, it is not described the way it was shown in the 1980s television serial. Anyway, that's a separate sidetrack. So the point is, what do you hold as the locus, okay, around which you build the story? That's one aspect. The second aspect is to make the story, the story comes in a particular way in the mind of a storyteller to make the story interesting. Where in the UK, if you see the movie Braveheart, it's not William Wallace's actual story. Right? There are many changes to it. At least I'm not aware of any historical records of William Wallace having an affair with the French princess who became the English queen. No, at least I'm not aware. Okay, now that was fictional, which added to the drama of the story. But the key thing is that what is a book's core purpose? What is it built for? Is it to showcase some research? Is it to showcase a good story? Or is it to communicate a message? For me, the key message which drove why I wanted to write Legend of Suheldev, is to me it's a unifying story. And that's what I wanted to showcase. That it is the story of Indians of all religious groups across different regions, across different caste groups, coming together to fight a foreign invader and winning, right? Uh, and that to me is a very, very important message to show. And therefore, the story is, is built around that locus. Does that mean that I'm not following the actual historical facts? Yeah, of course. There is no historical fiction which follows the actual historical facts, because the reality is, usually if you follow the actual historical facts, A, it usually is a very boring story. Okay. B, as you know, I read once, the difference between fiction and real life is fiction is supposed to make sense, right? Often what you see in historical facts, many of those incidents actually don't make sense. They don't tend to flow logically. Things happen in a way. But when a reader is reading a book, he or she expects it to flow logically. Right? And therefore, the author has to interpret facts.
Sure. Great. I shall take you up on another occasion, since I am happy to qualify as a historian about whether actual research-based history writing is boring or not. But that is not the topic for discussion today. No, let me push you further along the line that you are speaking. What I am slowly trying to get at is this, that one of the most interesting things, say in the last 30 years that I have been studying history, world history, and we'll come to the question of Braveheart, we'll come to the question of legends versus and dramatization and all later on, is that the subject, the academic subject of history, has a peculiar problem that actually does not apply to most other academic subjects. And that is, everyone thinks that history belongs to them. Right?
But that's a privilege too.
Yeah.
It's not a problem, it's a privilege.
Right.
Because there's so much interest in it.
Sure. But I'll tell you what the problem is for those who then train themselves formally in the discipline, in the subject of history, okay, is that what you then have, and this is the point I was trying to ask you about writing historical fiction, is that you have this mass of the world of people who are sensitized and aware to a sense of the past, okay, but a past that has not been deciphered or distilled through established protocols of studying a discipline in the way that anyone else would study any other discipline, okay, whether it be finance or management or law or anything. What it then does is they then come across a book of historical fiction, okay, which says on its cover, look, guys, this is fiction, okay, but its core reference is a true event. So I am happy to begin this conversation by saying that the Suheldev book, 99.9% could qualify as fiction, but there is a 0.1% which is true, okay, which is the person of Suheldev and the core episode around it. The rest of it, because actually there is very little text.
There's very little record.
Okay, so
the first historical thing is Mirate Masudi, which comes.
Yeah, we'll come to Mirate Masudi. Yeah. Yes, 1620. Is that, and that is why I was asking you the question, which is that, and I'm going to ask you the same question in its reverse now, which is that I agree with you that by confessing that yours is a work of historical fiction and not of history, you gain various kinds of license, but it isn't the same as writing any fiction. It's not the same as writing a murder mystery, okay, set in contemporary times, let's say, just for the sake of argument, because I read a lot of murder mysteries as well, okay, is that, and that's why I was asking you, that do you think that writing historical fiction carries a different sense of responsibility? But you've answered that question. My question to you now is the reverse. Do you think that writing historical fiction could potentially run the risk of distorting the common person's sense of the past. The common person who has not spent years and years pursuing history as a discipline and subject, because people study various sorts of things. Because this ties up with my question of the death of the author and the reader's construction of the narrative. You don't have control over what your reader is taking away from your book. You've tried your best. We've agreed to that. Okay. And yet you are referring to real place names. You are referring to customs and practices that are still in contemporary times palpable. Bahraich is still a place in Uttar Pradesh, and still one which is in ritual terms very, very active and palpable. Okay, so you have done nothing.
As is Shravasti.
As is Shravasti. You have done nothing to trigger it, but it gets triggered in the reader's mind. Do you think that historical fiction, while being written in the name of fiction, runs the potential risk, even perhaps unintended risk, of distorting a sense of the past?
It's an interesting question, and I think perhaps the only answer to this can be a philosophical one.
Sure, go ahead.
That A, what is the truth? And B, what is the purpose of truth?
Okay.
So there is, I'm sure you've heard of, the famous story, of Rishi Kaustik, who was sworn to speak the truth all the time. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it's mentioned in the Mahabharata, where there are a bunch of travelers who are escaping from a bunch of bandits chasing them. And the Rishi is meditating at a fork on the road. The travelers escape in a particular way, in a particular direction. And the bandits come just a bit later and ask the Rishi Kaushik, which way did they go? And I remind you, he's a Rishi, so which is, for those who are non-Indians would know, it's like not exactly, but roughly the equivalent of a prophet or a messiah, right? So very knowledgeable, right? And because he's sworn to the truth, tells the bandits the truth, right? And the bandits go, and well, the travelers don't survive, they get looted. In the traditional dharmic way, there's no permanent hell, there's no permanent heaven. It's kind of like a purgatory where you cleanse your karma and then you come back to earth. I mean, the purpose is a release from the cycle of births. So there's no permanent hell, there's no permanent heaven. But the thing to note is Rishi Kaushik goes to purgatory for that crime. He spoke the truth. He spoke the truth, right? Now, there's a philosophical thing that comes from the Indian way, that A, what is the truth? B, what is the purpose of the truth? Let me answer this, since we're in the UK, let me answer this from another perspective. From the perspective of most of the British, Winston Churchill is a hero. And I respect that. I respect their point of view of seeing Winston Churchill as a hero because he protected their country from the Nazi invasion. Fair. I, as an Indian, have an exact opposite view. Right? I, as an Indian, would have a view that Winston Churchill ordered a famine, Madhuri Banji's book, which killed millions of my fellow Indians in 1942, 1943. And the way I, as an Indian, would see it, Hitler was a monster, no doubt, but he didn't kill any Indians. Right? But Winston Churchill did this to Indians. Why should I see Winston Churchill as a hero? Why shouldn't I see him as a villain? Now, whose truth is the truth? The British truth is the truth from their perspective. And again, as an Indian who's comfortable with multiple truths, because Indians don't have the concept of there is one truth and you have to follow it, otherwise you'll go to hell. You don't have that concept. So I will accept and respect the right of a British person to see Winston Churchill as a hero, but I will also respect my right to not see Winston Churchill as a hero because of what he did to my people. Now, so this is, what is the truth in this? Both interpretations are true. Facts are the same, but both interpretations are true. Why? Because life is hugely complex. Right? Now, if you understand this, that there are multiple truths, that there is no one truth, and a lot of it is driven by our observer bias, not by facts. The facts about Winston Churchill are exactly the same, right? And yet our observer bias, me being an Indian, I see Winston Churchill differently. And a British person will very fairly, I repeat, very fairly see Winston Churchill differently. They are two completely opposing truths. So that's one part of it, that what is the truth? Second, then, what is the purpose of truth? And for this, we go back to Rishi Kaushik. If the objective of a fictional story is, say, to cause dissonance, divisions, and chaos, even if it is the truth, is that better? Or a fictional interpretation of the truth, the objective of which is unity, the objective of which is to make some sense of peace with historical wounds, right? Because unaddressed historical wounds, like in the Arab world, like in India, like in many parts of the world, like in the US, you can see it leads to poison. And ignoring it doesn't make the wound go away. You know? So much better to address it in an interpretation which can hopefully lead to unity. Which truth is better? It's a philosophical answer. It's not an academic answer. I tend to think an interpretation of the truth which is aiding the cause of unity, which is aiding the cause of peace in today's day, even if it's a fictional interpretation of the truth, is maybe a better approach. Again, like Rishi Kaushik perhaps could have said that I know I may have sworn to speak the truth all the time, but in this case, I will lie to save those poor travelers.
I'm going to get, you began with saying that you were going to give a philosophical answer, and you've given a philosophical answer, and philosophy has a lot of place in history, I am delighted to say. However, I think it is fair to acknowledge that philosophy occupies only a space in the discipline of history. To take you up on your point, but very, very briefly, because I want to get on with certain other things that you have mentioned just now, as well as other things that I want to ask you, is that there are several people in this country who see Churchill as not quite the heroic form that many others see it. And yes, Churchill's dominant profile is of heroism. And if you look at it from this country's perspective—
I will repeat once again, I am not questioning the right of a British person to see him as a hero. From their point of view, it's fair. It's fair.
I'm not saying that to you. What I was saying was, there are also critical perspectives on it. Just as I can spot to you Indians, since you referred to Indians, because that wasn't a category I was necessarily referring to, but since you referred to Indians, I can point out Indians to you who don't think that Churchill is a quote-unquote villain or something. So what I'm trying to say to you is that the basis of your very philosophical proposition is that this whole idea of multiple perspectives. And Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon became such an important movie for that reason. And I am going to come to that eventually.
Rashomon is the interpretation, is the inspiration for the narrative structure of the Ramchandra series, actually.
Yeah, because the thing, what Rashomon made public and common to the world is that different people can be viewing the same thing and have completely different perspectives and ideas and narratives of it. There's a very interesting story by Edgar Allan Poe as well, which is very similar, where a group of people hear one sound And different people interpret the sound in different ways, thinking it could be the murderer, it could be the thief or the robber, and it's very, very interesting. But let us go on. Thank you very much for that answer. It was quite entertaining. Let me proceed, having made the point to you that one of my concerns when I read historical fiction is how closely the fiction sails to the professional discipline of history, right? Because it is a skilled profession. Now, one of the things that you commit to, even before you begin to tell the story, and you then reassert it several times through the story, and I will give you some examples, is about India as a unit, as a singular unit. What you then go on to do through your fiction is to highlight constantly, chronically, that the problem is that there is so much of disunity. And there is if one takes a step back from the master narrative about Suheldev, yeah, you actually see that there is in the novel a constant balancing and counterbalancing of what are the forces that pull apart and what are the forces that bring together. Okay, and it's a very, I don't want to say it's a chessboard, but it's a very interesting arrangement, you know, and it keeps moving. And I was consciously, because I read it twice, I was consciously following it. Now, in making the point about India as a singular unit, before you even begin telling the story, you refer to the Vishnu Puran. Okay. Now, the Vishnu Puran, for the benefit of those who may not have had the time to look at it, refers, of course, to Bharatvarsh, right? You choose the English derivative word of the Greek name Indica, from which we get Megasthenes Indica, from which we get
It's based on Sindhu, Indus.
Yeah. And book 2 of the Vishnu Puran actually says that which lies to the north of the ocean and to the south of the snowy mountains.
Uttaram yat samudrasya himadrayschaiva dakshinam varsham tada bharatam nama bharti yatra santati. Yeah,
is called Bharat, where the progeny is
where
called
the descendants of Bharat.
Yeah. Okay. Now, that being so, everyone who reads the Vishnu Puran, academically or otherwise, will agree, as I hope you will, that one of the most important modern day academic questions is that a nation is at the same time, a geographical space, which is what this description is, north of the rivers, south of the snowy mountains, etc., etc.
North of the ocean, Samudras.
Yeah.
North of the ocean.
Yeah. As it is an entity, nation, or India in this case, is an entity that is forged as much by subscription to a common imagination. Okay, and in fact, your book is constantly struggling with the fact of why a common imagination does not overpower the forces that pull apart. Okay, now all pre-modern societies in India, and it'll be, and I'm sure you'll be interested to know, if you don't already know, that actually for the longest time in the traditional textual historical archives, and when I say textual, you see textual now is used to include even coins and inscriptions, etc. But I'm actually talking about more traditional forms of chronicler texts. There is actually, for the longest time, no defined history of India, as it were, to use India in the way that you are using. And the reason it isn't is because it was not there in the political imagination of the multiple units that made it apart. And this is not unique to India in any way. Okay, people thought in terms of polities, kingdoms, conquering neighbors, expanding their kingdom, and etc., etc. My question to you is, and it also derives from your earlier question that you just answered, is that you are at the end of it writing for the youth of the 21st century. You know, that's where we began our conversation from. Is it not the superimposition of a contemporary notion of a contiguous belonging in a geographical space that you are harnessing in order to make certain very important other points that I will come to, which are the points about what pulls apart and what brings together, you know, because actually the dynamics of that functions at another level. And in your historical fictional novel, it actually constantly functions at the social level.
That is the debate. I think the best way, good question, very good question. I think the best way to address this is to think, what is a nation? What defines a group of people as together? A nation or a larger unit would be a civilization. Is it always a political concept, or is it a cultural concept? And if they are forged together, how do they get forged together? So one of the things that's very clear, and you're a historian, you know this much better than I would. The modern concept of political nation states emerged only from the treaties of Westphalia, which is relatively recent, just a few centuries, 17th century, if I'm not mistaken, 18th century. And that's when the nation state became the sovereign. Prior to that, the definition of a nation would be more cultural rather than political. So there were times when England ruled parts of France. If my European history is not wrong, I mean Normandy and those parts, England did rule for some time. So politically, it was a part of England, but culturally, it was a part of the French nation. That's very clear. And this was true across the world. So political nation states did not necessarily conform to cultural nations. Right? But if you define a nation as what culture pulls it all together. For example, there is a Western civilization, right, which is at many fundamental levels different from the Arab civilization. It's different from the Indian civilization. It's different from the Chinese civilization. Now, some of the conceptions of the Western civilization one can have some debates with, right? So, for example, for Northern Europeans like Germany, UK, to see Greece and Rome as their cultural ancestors, one can debate against that, because Rome was actually destroyed by Germanic invaders. Right? And Nassim Nicholas Taleb speaks the theory of actually the Mediterranean world was one cultural unit, Northern Europe was another cultural unit. Right? So according to his theory, Tunisia and Libya had more in common with Italy than Germany had with Italy. Right? That is Nassim Nicholas Taleb's theory. But this is a civilization that has been forged together, Western civilization. And they find texts to support this. The question that arises is, did the cultural concept of India exist? Right? In ancient times, you find enough textual evidence to show that it does. One example is, of course, the Vishnu Puran, right? But there are many other examples like this. Chanakya speaks of Bharatvarsha with the same description, north of the ocean, south of the Himalaya. right? There live the descendants of Bharat. Rajendra Chola, who was from Tamil Nadu, he had conquered up to Southeast Asia as well. They were his. They used to pay him tribute. So if you go by the rules of how it's recognized as an empire, then you can say Southeast Asia was a part of his empire. He changed his name only once when he conquered up to Ganga. He took on the title Gangai Konda, the one who brought the waters of Gangaji down to Tamil Nadu. Why did he do that? Why was it an emotional moment for who was the most powerful man in the world at that time, Rajendra Chola? Right? Kumbh Mela has been going on for God knows how long, right? And from across India, people would gather together. The Pashupati Nath Ji at Nepal till today has priests who come from Kerala. Right? Shankaracharya Ji went to set up 4 dhams, and this was the 7th century. The 4 dhams in north, west, east, and south India. He didn't go to Burma. He didn't go to Iran. That wasn't the cultural concept of the land, right, of Bharat. So politically, was India not a nation state? Pre-treaties of Westphalia, yes, but neither was any other nation in the world. But culturally, was it a unit which thought of itself differently from others? Just as the Greco-Roman world was culturally a unit which thought of itself differently from, say, the Germanic people, African people. Yes, it was true. So therefore, once again, then this comes down to multiple truths. If you see it, then you see that culturally we saw commonalities. Right? That's what I interpreted the book.
Sure. Now, I took your point earlier on about the question of multiple truths. My question remains, which is, and I take your point about modern nation states, and my question was about whether you were superimposing a modern concept onto a pre-modern context. But, and may I add over here, since you were speaking, that Al-Biruni in his text also talks about cultural traits. Okay, no one goes so far as to say this series of cultural traits therefore unifies an entire number of people.
But he refers to what he thinks are the traits of Hindus.
Practices. Okay.
And I should clarify, at least from what my understanding of Al-Biruni, when he was talking about Hindus, he wasn't talking about the Hindu religion. He was talking about the people who live on the east of Sindhu, which is essentially Indian subcontinent.
Yeah, I mean, also because, and as you must know, that the very word Hindu comes from
Persian.
Because it comes from Arabic because of, the whole idea of being able to say sir or her.
Yeah, in Persian it wasn't there, so the ones to the east of Sindhu were called Hindu, and then that went to the Arab world, and then it went to...
So the very word Hindu is actually, in that sense, has never been...
We use the term dharma for our...
So now the point is, as you said, in the case of Al-Biruni, but even in others, the community of being the point about the cultural nation is that it is still not a unified nation, which is a point you make repeatedly in the novel. Okay, you make it in the context of, therefore, this unity led to not being able to harness one's resources, and therefore they lost to foreign invaders, etc., etc. But it is very, very important to bear in mind that, one, that it is the majority of the population living in the geographical mass of, whether you want to call it India as you do, or you want to call it Bharatvarsh, or you want to call it what we understand as undivided India, or whatever you want to call it, from whichever perspective, the majority of people lived in an extremely fluid and flexible
political environment. Yeah.
Socio-cultural system in which, as you began with saying, someone like a character like Suheldev did not necessarily belong to a higher caste. And this brings me to a very, very fundamental point that you make very cleverly, may I add, in your book. There are several instances where you make comments about caste. Okay. You don't necessarily say that caste is a cause of disunity, but you do highlight the fractious power of this practice. Okay. I will not give away too many details because I'm sure there are people who are interested in reading it and would want to read it.
This is the cover. Go buy it. It's on Amazon.
But there is a description of the massacre of a village on the outskirts of another settlement, and all the people who lived in the village were leather workers. Yeah. Okay. Anyone, and one doesn't have to be Indian to decipher this, anyone who is aware of and has studied India will know what is being referred to over here. Okay. The whole question of whether those who work and deal with leather can be made part of mainstream society, and the ideas of pollution and taboo that accompany. Okay. There is another example, which can be said quite openly because I don't think that gives away anything, is that there is a scene where Suheldev is going to eat along with a group of his sort of
from all different castes and
fraternal kings, because the presence of other kings and princes is very important in the setting, and the hesitation on their part. Okay, I was very struck by it because I was having read the Vishnu Puran. I knew what idea of nation you were working with. Okay, and it is a problematic idea precisely because of caste. And caste is only one of the problems in this setup. Now, no one today, okay, and you and I have never even spoken about this, but no one is going to say that discrimination based on caste is correct or acceptable in humanity. Okay, we have had laws in India for the longest time against it. But we also know, even from very contemporary and recent events, that it does not stop people. Okay. Caste then is quite simply a core social fracturing device. Okay. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who study Hinduism who will tell you, you cannot imagine Hinduism without caste. Okay, the very construction of it is so that it has the caste and all the problems that come with it. Throughout your book, you rail against it. You keep on saying, and I've only given 2 examples, and I've read your book very, very carefully. I hope you'd understand from my questions how much attention I have given to reading it. But given that historically and in contemporary times, and you are writing for a 21st century audience, as an author of historical fiction, do you have hope that this message will get through, that it is in the interests of humanity, whether humanity chooses to see itself as Indians, that perhaps these divisions and practices based on caste are detrimental?
Firstly, I think it's my duty to speak against the caste system. And I say that as a very proud Hindu. I have never denied that I'm a very, very proud Hindu. I wear an Om Namah Shivaya Kada. I wear a Rudraksh Mala. I do a Mahamrityunjay jap every morning. I'm a very proud Hindu. And as a proud Hindu, I say, it is my duty to speak against the caste system and do all that I can against it. There are some who say that that the birth-based caste system is a basic feature of our of dharma, essentially Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, the dharmic religions. I respectfully disagree. Again, there is enough textual evidence to support this. The Rig Veda speaks of of, 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 of rishis who weren't born to, to Brahmins as such. They became rishis through their karma. Valmiki ji, who wrote the original Valmiki Ramayana, was not born to a Brahmin. We all know that. Ved Vyas ji, who composed the Mahabharata, and he got the title Ved Vyas because he compiled the 4 Vedas. His original name was Krishna Dwaipayan. He was the son of a fisherwoman. In the Ramayana, the Purohit, the officiating priest of the Ayodhya royal family, which means Lord Ram's officiating priest, doesn't get more senior than that, was Maharishi Satyakam Javali. He had composed the Javali Upanishad. He was the son of a single Shudra mother. He did not even know who his father was.
Amish, caste is still a reality.
This is not there in the text. In the Bhagavad Gita, for example, Lord Krishna says, Chaturmanyam Maya Shrushtam Guna Karma Vibhagasha. The 4 Varnas were created on Guna and Karma. He doesn't mention birth anywhere. Dr. Ambedkar, in his book, Who Were the Shudras, uses textual evidences to show that practically all scriptures written before 500 Common Era, 1500 years ago, did not have caste based on birth. Okay? And he showed how texts written progressively later and later became casteist. Our greatest dynasties, our greatest rulers, the Mauryas, the Guptas, were not born Kshatriyas. Even till today, there is a scheduled caste in North India called the Mauryas. Right? So this is something that has emerged relatively recently. That's the first thing. The second thing, it is obvious for people to, you have to be blind not to see it, that as the caste system became more and more rigid, India became weaker and we kept losing repeatedly to foreign invaders. There was a time when foreign invaders used to come, like the Huns who went to Europe, came to India as well during the time of the late Guptas, during the time of Skandagupta and Kumar Gupta. They were beaten back. Alexander the Great essentially fought the king of 1/5 of Pakistani Punjab. That's who Porus was, right? And he was fought almost to a standstill out there. He didn't even fight the main Indian empire of the time, Nanda, right? So I think it's obvious that the birth-based caste system weakened us, right? There is a conversation I have in the book between Govardhan, who's a Kshatriya, and King Suheldev, and Kashinath, who's
Kashinath. That's the one I was referring.
Where they speak clearly of how the caste system has divided us, it has weakened us, and in my view, fighting against the caste system is not just the patriotic thing to do, it is also the dharmic thing to do, because it is not there in our ancient texts. There's a reason why I don't use my surname on any of the cover of my books. I haven't used it from my first book, from 2010. I have to use my surname on my driving license, passport, etc. I won't be allowed into the UK without that. But on the cover of the books, I thought I'll be true to my principle. My surname is a caste surname. So I don't want to use it on the cover of my book. That judge me not where I was born, judge me for my karma, right? Now, I'm not saying that's some big statement or anything, right? I'm just saying I have to make my small contribution to a country that I love, to a culture that I love. And this is a part of loving your culture, is celebrating the things that are good, but also wanting to improve the things that are not good. And
Fair
then I
enough.
speak against the caste system. That's the way I see it.
Fair enough. You make another point about unity and disunity. You make several points, but I'm going to give you another extreme example from another side. And I was struck by it because of my own academic training. Throughout the book, from the beginning, you make a difference between Indian Muslims and Turks. Very early on, you introduce a character called Wasim. Wasim is followed by Iqbal. Iqbal is followed by Abdul, and so on and so forth. And on another occasion, it will be very, very interesting to talk about how you picked these names, because each of these names also have their resonances. Okay. And one of the more interesting names that you pick is actually Kasar Khan. Right, because Kasar is also a Mongol name, and as you would surely know, that Mongols at this time were not Muslims.
No,
they were tribal. Mongols convert to Islam only around the 1330s.
Quite late, 13th century. But the Mongols and Turks used to interact quite a lot, so names traveled forth.
1330s, and also Islamization amongst the Mongols is actually a relatively slow process because their tribal identity is very, very heightened.
The Tingli religion was very strong.
Yeah, and therefore, one of the abiding errors that the world makes is to think that anyone who has the surname Khan is a Muslim.
Yeah, correct.
No, Khan are not Muslim. Khan means chieftain. Now a majority of people, who are Khans may be Muslim, but historically it is not so.
No, they want.
But let's get on with Indian Muslims versus Turks. Do you think that this very important message, because the truth is that Islam, which is a religion that originated in the Middle East, okay, its presence was first felt in India in non-violent forms through trade. The oldest mosques in India, which are on the Malabar coast, are all small mosques built by traders or because of the presence of trade, and trade was a seasonal activity. Okay, I'm not going to get into the question of how you come into having Muslims in armies, because there's also a very interesting historical reality of military slavery in Islam, which is a very distinct feature of Islamic armies. But you do, and you constantly, there are situations in the novel where the character says, I am first an Indian, then a Muslim. Okay, there is a place where one character says, I don't want to say who the character is, but one character says, Lord Ram says this, Allah says this, and the same person is saying it in two consecutive sentences, and they're messages of harmony. Okay, there is a very, very nuanced discussion of Sufis. And what you suggest in passing in another story of Kashinath's, and which is historically considered to be true, and I will come to historical facticity now, is that Islam in the subcontinent did spread through peaceful means and through Sufi activity. Okay, but to go back to my original point, which is separating Indian Muslims from Turks, you are clearly setting up the Turks as the outsiders. Okay, and in your story, they are the outsiders. Once again, as with the caste question, do you think that this message will get through in a world, and mind you, it's the world, it's not just India. I am unwilling to be accusative towards India alone, which is genuinely suffering from a perceived threat of Islam and from Islamophobia, because you are making a very nuanced point. The point you are making is that one's religious identity is subservient to one's inherent loyalty to whatever one is loyal. In your story, they're loyal to India.
No, I think I think that many of the older historians in India, Indian historians, post-independence, have done a disservice to India in the narrative that they've built up. If the British colonial rule is not called the Christian invasion, why is the Turkic colonial rule called the Islamic invasion? And if you see the texts, many of the medieval kings were very clear. So, for example, Krishna Dev Raya never said he defeated the Muslims. He said he defeated the Turuksha, which is Sanskrit for Turks. Right? Mughals is what we call the Mughals. They call themselves Temuria, which is descendant of Temur, who's a Turk. Chhatrapati Shivaji, again, he used the term Turks, never said Muslims. Okay? Indian movies, Bollywood movies have added to this confusion. When they show British colonial rulers, they very clearly show white-skinned, obviously foreign guys speaking English. But when they show Alauddin Khilji, they'll show Ranveer Singh speaking Urdu. Urdu is an Indian language.
Of course.
Right? It is not a foreign language. Alauddin Khilji did not speak Urdu. There's no historical evidence to show he spoke pure Lucknowi Urdu. He would have probably spoken Turkic, maybe it was Persian. And most Indians would not have understood anything of what he was saying. Right? That is true of Mahmud Ghazni. It is true of Muhammad Ghori. They were all Turks. Right? It's true of Babur. They were all Turks. They did not look in. Razia Sultan did not look like Hema Malini. Okay. To Indian eyes, they would have probably looked Chinese. Right? The Chinese could have probably differentiated between themselves and the Central Asians. To Indian eyes, they would have looked similar to us, similar to the Chinese, and they would not have been speaking Urdu. Right? Now, what this historical narrative has done is injected poison into our body politic. Because were there massive crimes that the Khiljis or the Tughlaqs, the Mughals outside of Akbar, did they do? Yes, they did. That is a fact, right? Those same Turks carried out a lot of crimes in the Arab lands as well, right? There's a lot of historical pain. I have a lot of Arab friends. There's a reason why there's so much unfocused anger in the Arab world as well, because they also have a lot of historical pain, right? First the Turks, then the Europeans. And look, the thing is, if this is a part of your civilizational memory, you have to make peace with it somehow, right? Like African Americans have to make peace with their historical pain. And as Gautam Buddha has said, you don't make peace with it for the benefit of someone else. You make peace with it for your own benefit, right? You have to somehow make peace with it. Right? And I think understanding this basic fact that they were not Indians, they were foreigners. They did not speak Urdu. They were not Indian Muslims. They were not Indian Muslims, right? I think understanding that will perhaps help us pull this poison out of this body politic. And it has a large element of truth to it as well.
Yeah, I think it is, I would, as someone who has studied that period for research, I would say that it is correct to say that they were not native to the subcontinent. But I think the derivative problem is that it does not mean that everyone who descends from that remains a perpetual foreigner.
No. Look,
right?
The point is, everyone has a right to their point of view.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not saying.
Now the point
saying
is,
saying
how do we have? It's like, for example, I'm a Shaivite, right? I'm a Lord Shiva worshipper.
Yes,
One of the
Amish,
greatest.
that you've made that obvious many times.
One of the greatest temples
I
of
did
Ram,
check
of Lord Shiva, is in Kashi. Kashi Vishwanath ji.
Yeah.
It was destroyed by Aurangzeb. The historical fact. The mosque was built on top of it. There are pictures you can see of the back of the temple. Now, I'm not saying anyone today has to be blamed for it, but can it be reasonably said that this is a source of historical pain for me? I'm again repeating, this is not, no one today, there's no, I don't believe in this concept of historical vengeance and, community crimes. These are very dangerous concepts. I don't believe in this concept of community guilt, historical guilt. These are very dangerous concepts, because then it's just a cycle of vengeance again and again. There is no end to it. Right? But can one feel pain of that very terrible historical crime? Yes. How do we make peace with it?
Right. Okay. We're running out of time. I would have asked you another question, which interested me very much, but we're going to give it a miss. Is that in one of the interviews, I watched a few interviews about this book on YouTube. In one of them,
you've done a lot of research.
Well, I took this very seriously, as I should. You referred to a very, very important book, a book that very few people read, which is Radha Vallabh Tripathi's Vada.
Oh, I love that.
And
you read it?
I
will clarify once again. He is no relation of mine, so there's no nepotism out here. I'm genuinely recommending that book because it's a damn good book.
It is a very good book, and I had actually read it. I had the copy, but I went back and looked at it again because you mentioned it. I would have had a conversation with you about it, but we're running out of time, because I do want to come to Mirate Masudi. Mirate Masudi, Mirror of Masud, written by Abdur Rahman Chishti in the 1620s, is the principal source for the story of Salar Masud. Okay. Now, and you mentioned it yourself. I was going to mention it. Now, my own PhD is on a person called Ziauddin Barni, who is buried in Nizamuddin Aulia's Dargah in Delhi. He wrote 6 or 7 texts. My PhD focuses on one, but I have read as many of the other extant ones that are available. Not all his texts are available anymore. But I can tell you with the confidence that one has at this moment about historical knowledge that is verifiable, that there is no evidence to suggest that Salar Masud was a person who was in any way related to Mahmud of Ghazni. However, Amir Khusro mentions him, as does Ibn Battuta. And by the time of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, he actually physically visits Bahraich. So there is a character called Masud. Okay? It is just that there is no connection over there, even though all the details you take are available in the Mirate Masudi. Okay? And I feel compelled to say, because of my loyalty to my own profession, is that it is important in the world in which we live and the country that you and I are living in at the moment. I have one more book to show to you, which is on King Arthur. Okay. The history of Britain begins with this legendary king, which is King Arthur. There is no demonstrable, verifiable evidence to suggest that such a person existed. But from the 12th century exists, undoubtedly. Okay. But so legends are very common to history and history writing. History was being written by humans, and often history by Abdur Rahman Chishti was also a profession, a source of livelihood. They wrote for patrons.
Right.
Okay. They were not virtuous divine acts that one performed, even if one wanted to show it that way. Okay.
Yeah.
The point is,
they had a commitment to their patron rather than the facts.
Absolutely. And therefore, a very large part of chronicler history is actually written from the position of the self as the center of the whatever of the story that is being narrated. So archives, these kinds of textual archives, are actually archives and repositories of information. They're not repositories of facts. Because in any case, establishing facts is not only very difficult, but history is one of those humbler professions and subjects where we always believe that what I today believe to be accurate can change tomorrow if new evidence comes to light. And that evidence has to be verifiable. So in the best of times, history is actually perspectival, as in Rashomon. Be that as it may, and as we come towards the end, we have 5 more minutes, and I am going to give you the last word on this. Would you think that it would take away either from the framing device and the core intention of your historical novel, as well as from your divine inspiration, if I were to tell you that the core supposition
of him being a nephew
is unverifiable?
Is unverifiable.
And by that logic, therefore, it is not possible to necessarily contend that there was a battle, even though you have a date for the battle. And it's not a date you have come up with. Abdur Rahman Chishti came up with it, okay, which is the 14th of June, okay, 1034.
Yeah, which is why it's a summer battle. And
yeah, exactly. And the whole weather thing functions, okay, the climate and
it's
weather.
a part of the battle.
And by the same logic, therefore, the near complete absence of any information on Suheldev or Soheldev or whatever be the name, okay,
pre the gazetteers, the British
is equally tenuous. Would it take away from your engagement with this kind of historical fiction if I were to say that to you? And which I say, which is my position.
Sure.
Having said that, I hope I have conveyed to you that I took your novel very, very seriously.
Yeah. There is a view, among some of the historians who I've met and engaged with in the West and in India, that history writing till now has not given as much respect to folk tales and popular versions of history rather than the written versions. And there's that brilliant African line that till the lions get their storytellers, the stories of the hunt will always glorify the hunters, right? Which is a much more poetic way of saying that the winners write history. And at a time in India where the caste system was slowly becoming rigid, and subaltern versions of history would in any case survive more in folk traditions rather than the written form. Is there a case for looking at folk traditions as well and seeing if there's an element of truth in there? From what I know, the versions that we have, since we're sitting in the UK, of King Alfred's story, Edward the Elder, is to a very large extent also based on folk tales, folk traditions, to a reasonable extent, and not just texts. And I think most historians agree that, from what I know, that King Alfred, King Edward did exist, and they were the first of the Anglo-Saxon, the Saxon kings who started the England as we understand it today. Is there a case, therefore, for historians in India as well to delve into folk traditions and folk tales which have remained alive for centuries? And this is especially true for communities that weren't ruling communities for long, right? And these interpretations don't just impact, say, the story of a king like King Suheldev. There are so many others who perhaps have played an important role in our history, right? In Indian history. To think that it was only the ruling dynasties, only the Mauryas, Guptas, the Cholas, and only they, forged India as we know it, or the movements of history, would not be fair to a land that is continental in scale. Often we Indians ourselves do not understand the scale of our country. There are more people in India than all of America, all of Europe, all of Middle East combined. India is more a continent than a country. So I have relied, to some extent on folk tales, which are very popular till today, right? And as a fiction writer, I've assumed, could there be something to these folk tales?
Absolutely.
Is it actually, the version of history of the powerless who did not have the power to stamp and write their chronicler version? And my only submission is, should historians also explore this and find that can there be archaeological evidence? Can there be things which support this? And if my book kind of triggers interest into a subject like this, and if we, I'm speaking just as an Indian, a subaltern caste hero who unites Indians of all castes, all religions, it is such a lovely story. It would be so wonderful if it was true. I don't know the exact truth. This is my truth, okay? But I'd love it for historians to explore this, and I would suggest look at folk tales and folk traditions as well, not just textual evidence.
Sure. Sadly, we have to draw this to a close, but could I just say first, thank you very much for giving the time. This has been a most interesting discussion. Yes, history as we know it, the knowledge of history across the world, not just in India, but we are talking about India, is the story of those who had both the power as well as the resources to leave traces behind. Okay, and that leaves out the majority of people.
Yeah, who were powerless. Yeah.
Who had neither the resources nor the logistics to leave any kind of trace behind. Okay, so the history, even today, with all the knowledge of the world and its history that we know, is in fact a fraction of what has happened in the past. Okay, my questions today, from the academic perspective, were principally to agree that that we should be very cautious in today's climate to lay claims to the truth. And I think you and I have agreed that there are several truths, there are multiple perspectives on the same truth, and that all the truths together, even when incompatible or mutually repellent, can still be harmonized in a frame. Amish Tripathi, Director of the Nehru Centre, and Amish, author of Suheldev. Thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure speaking with you. Bye.